Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we have a massive Reddit story about a hardworking mechanic who gets pushed out of his own family business, only to build an absolute empire in secret. Wait until you hear the ultimate checkmate he pulls at the end. Without wasting any more time, let's jump right into it. When I was 16, I knew I wasn't a favorite, but I didn't think my own father would one day look me in the eyes and say, "Pack your things, Elias. You don't belong here anymore." I'm 31 now, and yeah, that moment still plays on a loop in my head more often than I care to admit. Let me back up a bit. I'm Elias, and I'm the second son in a family that worshipped the first. My older brother, Preston, is 3 years older than me. Tall, charming, always knew the right thing to say. He had this uncanny ability to make people believe whatever fell out of his mouth. He could crash a customer's car, lie about it to my face, and somehow still get praised for telling the truth eventually. He was the golden boy, the heir apparent, the son who could do no wrong in the eyes of the man who ran our lives. Meanwhile, I was the quiet one. I keep my head down, try to be helpful, clean up messes I didn't make, and still get asked why I couldn't be more like Preston. We grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and our last name meant something because of the business our family built from the ground up. My grandfather started it, Miller & Sons Custom Garage. It wasn't just a repair shop. It was an institution, a place that became legendary around here for breathing life back into forgotten Detroit iron. Classic muscle cars, heavy-chested Mustangs, rumbling 60s Impalas, and mean-looking Chargers passed through our garage like family heirlooms. There was deep, undeniable pride in that grease-stained concrete. My grandfather was a man forged in a different era. He believed in handshakes, hard work, and the absolute sanctity of doing a job right the first time. I grew up practically breathing in the scent of 10W30 motor oil, stale coffee, and the sharp tang of welding ozone. To me, that garage was a cathedral. It was where broken things were given a second chance. I thought, naively, that if I dedicated my life to the craft, to the sweat and the dirt and the long hours, I would earn my place at the altar. My dad, Arthur Miller, took it over when Grandpa retired. But Arthur didn't have Grandpa's soul. He ran the shop like a military compound. Strict, efficient, no nonsense, and heavily focused on the bottom line. He demanded perfection from the torque on a lug nut to the sweep of the floor. But beneath the surface, he was a hard man to please, especially with me. He had a vision for the future of Miller & Sons, and that vision wore a tailored polo shirt, flashed $1 million smile, and answered to the name Preston. To Arthur, Preston was the future CEO, the charismatic face of the brand. Preston had never rebuilt a carburetor in his life. He didn't know the firing order of a standard V8, and he couldn't tell the difference between a blown head gasket and a bad spark plug to save his life. But he knew how to talk. He knew how to schmooze wealthy clients who brought in their midlife crisis Corvettes. He could joke around in the middle of a serious customer call, completely derail a meeting with his golf stories, and still get a hearty pat on the back from our father. But for me, the rules were entirely different. I was the grunt, the workhorse. I'd spend 4 extra hours after closing time, my hands bleeding and blistered, meticulously organizing the tool bay, wiping down every wrench, color-coding the sockets, and ensuring the hydraulic lifts were properly lubricated. And my father would walk in, look at the perfectly clean bay, glare at me and say, "Don't waste time on garbage no one sees, Elias. You need to focus on revenue-generating activities. Look at your brother. He just upsold a paint protection package." It is insane how often the guys actually doing the dirty, essential work get completely overlooked for the ones just talking about it. Arthur isn't just failing as a dad here. He's failing as a business owner by not valuing the real backbone of his shop. Fostering an environment that praises smooth talking over actual competence is a ticking time bomb for any business. He never mentioned that I was the one who actually had to apply that paint protection package while Preston was out drinking at the local country club. By the time I hit my late 20s, the writing was on the wall. It was painfully clear that Preston would inherit the business. And honestly, for a long time I convinced myself I was okay with that. I never wanted to be the boss. I didn't want to sit in a glass office, wear a clean shirt, and look at spreadsheets all day. I liked the grit. I liked being behind the scenes, tuning engines until they sang that perfect, guttural idle. I loved finding obsolete parts that no one else could track down. I loved the feeling of a heavy steel wrench in my hand and the vibration of a resurrected engine rumbling in my chest. I didn't need the spotlight. I just wanted to be part of the legacy. I thought if I worked hard enough, if I bled enough motor oil for the Miller name, my father would eventually look past Preston's smoke and mirrors and see my worth. I thought competence would eventually outweigh charisma. I was dead wrong. The older we got, the worse the disparity became. It started bleeding into every aspect of the business. During team meetings, Arthur would actively ask Preston for input on major operational changes. Preston would spout some trendy corporate buzzwords he read online, things like synergy, client retention funnels, and premium demographic targeting. Arthur would nod along like Preston had just delivered the Gettysburg Address. Meanwhile, if I brought up a legitimate critical issue, like the fact that our supplier was sending us substandard brake calipers that could literally cost a customer their life, or that our diagnostic software was a decade out of date, Preston would roll his eyes and my dad would sigh heavily. Elias, you're always focused on the negative. We need forward thinkers. Leave the big picture to Preston. I learned to keep my mouth shut. I swallowed my pride, day after day, year after year, hiding behind the hoods of cars, letting the roar of the engines drown out the disrespect. I thought I could survive it, but I didn't realize that my father and brother weren't just content with keeping me in the shadows. They wanted to strip away everything I had built for myself. The blatant inequality wasn't just in the way we were spoken to. It was baked into the very foundation of how we were valued as human beings. The Christmas before everything completely fractured, Preston strutted into the living room showing off a luxury Omega Speedmaster watch our dad had bought him to celebrate his executive leadership potential. It was a $5,000 piece of jewelry resting on the wrist of a man who hadn't turned a wrench in a decade. I, the lead mechanic who routinely worked 60-hour weeks to keep the shop from drowning in backlogs, received a $30 gas card and a half-hearted handshake. I remember standing there in the living room, feeling the cheap plastic of the gift card digging into my palm, while my mother looked away, pretending to be deeply fascinated by the Christmas tree ornaments. I swallowed the insult. I told myself it was just money. The shop, the cars, the honest work, that was what mattered. But the real knife in the back, the ultimate, unforgivable betrayal that completely severed my loyalty to Arthur Miller, wasn't about a watch or a paycheck. It was about my truck. My 1978 Ford F-150. For 3 grueling years, I had poured my absolute soul into that vehicle. I found it rotting in a barn 2 counties over. It was a rusted-out shell, the floorboards eaten away by decades of damp dirt, the engine block seized, barely a ghost of a truck. I dragged it into a dark, forgotten back corner of our lot, far away from the customer bays. I spent every spare dime I earned on it. Every weekend, every holiday, and every late night under a single flickering fluorescent bulb, I was out there, slowly bringing it back from the dead. I sourced original OEM parts from scrapyards across the Midwest. I hand-sanded the body panels until my knuckles were raw and bleeding, taking it down to the bare metal before treating the rust. I pulled the heavy 351 Windsor V8 engine out with a rented hoist and rebuilt it piece by piece on my living room floor because it was too cold in the shop during winter. I bored out the cylinders, installed a high-performance camshaft, tuned the Holley carburetor to absolute perfection, and painted the block a deep, aggressive black. I spent months prepping the body for paint, finally laying down a flawless coat of midnight blue. That truck wasn't just a vehicle. It was my sanctuary. It was my physical proof that I could create something beautiful from nothing. It was the one pure thing I had in a garage full of toxic family politics. It was my masterpiece, representing thousands of hours of my life. Then came the second week of November. We had a massive, high-stakes contract with a wealthy vintage car collector who was demanding his 1969 Camaro Z28 be finished by Monday. We desperately needed a rare, heavy-duty Tremec T56 transmission to handle the upgraded horsepower we'd built into the engine. Preston was specifically assigned to drive to a specialty supplier in Ohio, a 6-hour drive each way, to pick it up on Friday so I could install it over the weekend. Friday afternoon rolled around. No Preston. I called his phone. It went straight to voicemail. At 4 p.m., I walked into the main office to find a sticky note slapped onto my locker. Hey bro, something came up. Headed to Lake Tahoe with Jessica for the weekend. Need you to grab the trans from Ohio. Don't drop the ball on this one, Dad will be pissed. He bailed. He packed his bags and drove off for a romantic ski weekend, leaving me with a scribbled note and zero context. I didn't have a choice. If that transmission wasn't in the shop by Saturday morning, the client would pull the contract, and Arthur would undoubtedly blame me. I grabbed the keys to the shop's rattling cargo van, fueled up on stale black coffee, and hit the road. I drove 12 hours straight through the freezing night, navigating sleet and black ice, my back screaming in agony from the terrible seats, fueled by nothing but gas station hot dogs and a simmering, burning resentment. I did exactly what I always did. I sacrificed my own life to clean up my brother's mess and protect the Miller name. I arrived back at the shop on Saturday morning, exhausted, eyes bloodshot, my muscles aching down to the bone. I backed the van into the loading bay, hopped out, and started wrestling the heavy transmission crate onto a dolly. As I pushed the dolly through the main garage toward the heavy-duty lifts, my eyes drifted out the back windows toward my designated corner of the lot, the spot under the old oak tree where my midnight blue F-150 was parked. It was empty. A sickening, bottomless drop hollowed out my stomach. I blinked hard, thinking my exhausted brain was playing tricks on me. I dropped the dolly handle and sprinted outside into the freezing air. The gravel was bare. The truck was gone. Panic seized my chest. I ran back inside, bursting through the doors of the main office. Preston was sitting there. He wasn't in Tahoe. He was lounging in our dad's expensive leather chair, his expensive boots propped up on the mahogany desk, scrolling through his phone and sipping a premium iced latte like he was the king of the damn world. My father was sitting on the leather sofa opposite him, looking over some paperwork. Where is it? I demanded, my voice coming out as a hoarse, shaking roar. Where is my truck? Preston didn't even flinch. He slowly lowered his phone, gave a lazy, dismissive wave, and smirked. Oh, hey little brother. Welcome back. Good job on the parts run. Yeah, about the truck. I had a VIP walk in yesterday afternoon looking for a custom vintage build. A tech CEO from the city. He saw the F-150 out back, loved the midnight blue paint, and made a massive cash offer on the spot. I sold it. The shop really needed the liquidity for the new digital marketing push I'm planning for next quarter. The room started to spin. My vision tunneled. You sold it? I whispered, the words choking in my throat. You sold my truck? I bought every single part of that with my own money. I built that engine with my own hands. The title is in my name. Relax, Elias, Preston scoffed, rolling his eyes. I forged your signature on the transfer. It's not a big deal. We're a family business. What's yours is the shop's. I'll throw you a couple of grand from the profit once the marketing budget is settled. You should be thanking me. You'd never get that kind of money selling it yourself. He sold it. He sold 3 years of my blood, sweat, and tears for quick cash to fund his vanity projects. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. He just stole a piece of my soul. I turned to my father. My chest was heaving. My fists clenched so hard my fingernails were cutting into my palms. I waited for the explosion. I waited for Arthur Miller, the man who constantly preached about integrity, hard work, and the law, to tear into his eldest son for outright grand theft auto and forgery. I waited for him to demand Preston get the truck back immediately. Instead, my father slowly took off his reading glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, and looked at me with cold, tired irritation. Calm down and lower your voice in my office, Elias, Arthur snapped. It was taking up too much space in the back lot anyway. It was an eyesore. Preston found a highly lucrative deal and secured necessary capital for the future of this business. You should be learning from your brother's entrepreneurial mindset instead of throwing a tantrum over a pile of rusty scrap. The words hit me like a physical blow from a sledgehammer. He was protecting him. He was praising him. Preston had committed a felony against his own flesh and blood, and Arthur was framing it as brilliant executive leadership. My father then looked past me, his eyes landing on the transmission crate sitting on the dolly in the bay. He stood up, walked over to the window, clapped his hands once, and smiled. "Excellent work getting the transmission here on time," Arthur said, turning back to me. "That's my boy. Always reliable." He paused, stepping closer to me, his eyes narrowing slightly as he delivered the final, fatal blow. "It's good to have someone like you supporting Preston's leadership. Not everyone's meant to lead, Elias. Some men are just meant to turn the wrenches, and that's perfectly okay." I have to stop right here for a second. His brother literally forged a signature and committed grand theft auto. And the dad is just sitting there praising his entrepreneurial mindset? Can you believe how ridiculous this is? These parents are so shamelessly biased that they've completely lost their moral compass. They're straight up ignoring the law at this point. Supporting his leadership, as if I hadn't just driven 24 hours straight because Preston was too lazy to do his job. As if he hadn't just stolen the only thing in the world that mattered to me. Something inside me violently snapped in that office. A crucial, heavy wire was cut. I realized, with a terrifying, absolute clarity, that I was never a son to Arthur Miller. I was just a highly efficient piece of machinery, an asset to be used, depleted, and stepped on so his golden boy could shine. The true execution, the formal severing of my ties to the Miller family, came just a few weeks after the theft of my truck. I was still living in the cramped, dusty apartment right above the main garage. It wasn't glamorous by any stretch of the imagination. It constantly smelled of heavy exhaust, chemical solvents, and old rubber. The floorboards vibrated every time the air compressor kicked on downstairs. But it was free, and I was desperately hoarding my meager paychecks to buy my own small house, a place where no one could touch my things ever again. Despite the profound betrayal, I kept doing my job. I went numb. Every morning, I rolled out of bed at 4:30 a.m., grabbed a cup of bitter black coffee, and was down in the freezing pit running complex diagnostics, ordering specialty parts from overseas, and managing the aggressive out-of-state suppliers before the rest of the crew even punched their time cards. I handled all the dirty, complex logistics that Preston refused to touch because they didn't involve smiling at rich men. One evening in mid-December, out of nowhere, Arthur called a formal family meeting in the main house. We never did family meetings. The Millers weren't the type to sit around and talk about our feelings. We communicated through grunts, slammed doors, and passive-aggressive notes. So a formal sit-down was incredibly weird. I walked into the house, my hands still stained with grease I couldn't scrub out. We gathered around the heavy oak kitchen table. Mom had made a beef casserole, but the atmosphere in the room was thick and suffocating, like the air right before a tornado touches down. She kept her eyes glued to her plate, nervously pushing her food around, her shoulders hunched. She couldn't bear to look in my direction. Preston, on the other hand, was sitting tall. He was wearing a crisp button-down shirt, swirling a glass of expensive bourbon, and grinning like a predator that had finally cornered its prey. He knew exactly what was coming. I had this tight, cold knot twisting in my gut. My instincts were screaming at me to walk back out the door. Arthur cleared his throat loudly, resting his hands flat on the table, adopting the rigid posture of a judge about to deliver a final, unappealable verdict. "I've made a decision," Arthur announced, his voice booming in the quiet kitchen. "I'm getting older. I can't run this floor forever, and it's time to ensure the long-term future and expansion of Miller and Sons. I've met with the lawyers. I've officially signed the business, the brand, the client list, and all operational control over to Preston." He paused, letting the crushing weight of the words settle into the room. "Effective the 1st of next month." I blinked. I just sat there and blinked, trying to process the finality of it. I knew it was coming. Deep down, I always knew. But hearing it spoken aloud, Seeing the absolute triumph in Preston's eyes felt like a heavy steel door slamming shut on the first 31 years of my life. My grandfather's legacy, the blood and sweat of our family, was being handed over to a con artist. But my father wasn't finished. He looked me dead in the eyes. His face was completely devoid of empathy, warmth, or even regret. He delivered the final sentence casually, like he was asking me to pass the salt. "And Elias," Arthur said, his tone flat, "you'll need to vacate the apartment above the shop by the end of the month. Preston is going to need that space. He's planning to knock down the walls and hire a contractor to build a VIP client lounge to entertain our higher-tier demographic. You don't belong here anymore. It's time you figure out your own path." The silence that followed was deafening. I just stared at him. Then I slowly looked at my mother. Then at Preston, who took a slow, deliberate sip of his bourbon, looking immensely satisfied. I waited for anyone, to say it was a bad joke. I waited for my mother to finally find her spine, to stand up for me, to say, "Arthur, he's your son. Where is he supposed to go?" I even waited for Preston to have a microscopic shred of decency and say, "Come on, Dad. He can stay in the back." But no one did. The silence stretched, thick, toxic, and cowardly. They were throwing me out onto the street in the middle of winter so Preston could have a room to drink scotch and smoke cigars with rich guys. I realized then that I wasn't losing my family. I had never really had one. I was just the hired help and my lease was up. Just imagine being kicked out into the freezing cold in the dead of winter by your own father. And for what? So your golden child brother can have space for a VIP lounge to drink in. They literally value a party room more than your life. Honestly, if it were me, I wouldn't just take that lying down. I'd fight back. There's no way I'm letting them walk all over me like that. What would you even do in a situation like this? I didn't argue. I didn't yell. I didn't flip the table, scream about my truck, or demand an explanation. I had too much dignity left for a screaming match. I knew exactly how they would play it. They would call me unstable, jealous, and crazy. They wanted a reaction so they could justify their cruelty. I refused to give them the satisfaction. I just nodded slowly. I stood up from the table, my chair scraping loudly against the wood floor, and walked out the front door into the freezing air. I didn't wait until the end of the month. I didn't even wait until morning. I went straight up to the apartment above the garage. I grabbed 2 heavy canvas duffel bags and packed my life into the back of my old, reliable daily driver. I packed my clothes, my boots, and my personal paperwork. Then I went down to the bay. I meticulously packed every single wrench, socket, and diagnostic tool from my personal Snap-on chest, tools I had paid for myself. I left their cheap shop tools exactly where they were. I left everything else behind. The TV, the furniture, the memories. I drove away at 4 a.m., the cold engine of my car roaring to life in the silent town. I watched the Miller and Sons sign fade in my rearview mirror, the neon flickering against the dark sky. And as I crossed the county line, I swore to God I wouldn't look back. I wasn't broken. I was free. The world doesn't stop spinning just because your heart gets ripped out of your chest. You either lie down and let the dirt cover you, or you stand up and start walking. I chose to walk. I drove 50 miles away, putting enough distance between me and the Miller name to breathe clean air. I found a cheap, run-down 1-bedroom apartment in an industrial part of the next town over. The walls were paper-thin, the heat barely worked, and the pipes rattled, but the rent was something I could manage with my meager savings. I needed a job immediately to survive. I swallowed my pride, walked into a large competitor's garage, a massive multi-bay operation that Arthur always arrogantly mocked for being second-rate corporate sellouts, and asked to see the floor manager. I didn't mention my last name. I didn't mention Miller and Sons. I just said I had 15 years of heavy mechanical experience and I needed a wrench and a chance. They pointed to a botched Chevy 350 engine rebuild that their junior mechanics had been struggling with for 2 days. I diagnosed the timing issue by ear, pulled the distributor, reset the timing curve, and had the engine purring perfectly in 45 minutes. They hired me on the spot. Here is the beautiful, liberating thing about starting over in a place where nobody knows or cares who your father is. They only judge you by the calluses on your hands and the results of your labor. There were no toxic family politics. There were no golden children. There were no shadows for me to hide in. I kept my head down, kept my mouth shut, and worked with a relentless, burning ferocity that surprised even me. I diagnosed complex electrical faults in half the time of their senior mechanics. I stayed late to optimize their parts inventory system, drastically cutting their overhead costs. The owners of the shop weren't blind. They saw exactly what I brought to the table. In just 4 months, they pulled me out of the grease pit, handed me a clean uniform, and promoted me to lead floor manager. For the first time in my 31 years of life, I was making actual, impactful decisions. I was commanding genuine respect from a crew of hardened, seasoned mechanics, and I was truly feeling, like I belonged somewhere. But the daytime hustle, the respect of my peers, and the steady paycheck weren't enough to quiet the ghosts rattling around in my head at night. I needed my own project. I needed to build something from the ground up that belonged entirely to me. Something Preston couldn't steal and Arthur couldn't belittle. I needed an outlet for the years of suppressed creativity. Secretly, I took my first few bonus checks and rented a small, drafty storage shed on the edge of town. I bought a cheap tripod, some decent lighting gear, and a high-definition camera. I started a YouTube channel on the side. I didn't use my face at first, and I certainly didn't use my name. I called it Steel and Rust. I started filming myself working on weekend restoration projects. It was raw, authentic, and completely unpolished. There were no flashy, obnoxious intros, no fake manufactured garage drama, and no screaming at the camera. It was just me, the cold steel, my tools, and the methodical, almost therapeutic process of bringing dead metal back to life. I did the voiceovers late at night in my apartment, keeping my voice low and calm, explaining the history of the specific parts, the complex physics of the combustion cycle, and my personal philosophy of restoration. The first 24 videos barely scraped 100 views. But I didn't care. It was my therapy. Then, I found a wrecked, forgotten 1969 Pontiac GTO sitting in a scrapyard. I bought it for pennies, towed it to my shed, and set up the camera. I did a complete frame-off teardown and rebuild. I documented every agonizing hour of rebuilding the massive 400 cubic inch V8 engine and installing the iconic tri-power carburetor setup. I edited it into a gritty, atmospheric, 2-hour documentary-style time-lapse, scored with nothing but the natural sounds of ratchets clicking, grinders throwing sparks, and the final, glorious, earth-shaking roar of the engine firing to life. The algorithm caught it. The video didn't just do well. It exploded. It went viral across automotive forums and social media, racking up 2 million views in a single month. People didn't just love the car. They were starving for the authenticity. They loved the quiet expertise. They loved watching a master craftsman at work without the Hollywood bullshit. Within 3 months, Steel and Rust rocketed past 150,000 highly engaged subscribers. My inbox turned into a war zone. Massive, global automotive tool brands were reaching out, offering to send me pallets of high-end gear just for a 2-minute shout-out in my videos. Sponsorship money started rolling in, real money, the kind of money my father used to stress over during slow winters. Print magazines wanted interviews. I was quietly building a digital empire, a brand that commanded immense respect in the hardcore automotive community. But here is the most critical part. I kept it completely secret from my past. I didn't put my last name on the channel. I didn't brag to my old coworkers. I didn't send a petty link to my father to rub my success in his face. I kept it quiet because this new life, this empire, was for me alone. I wasn't doing it for revenge. I wasn't doing it to scream for my father's attention like a child. I was doing it to prove to myself once and for all that I was never the broken one. I was the engine that had kept my family's shop running all those years. And now, I was building an unstoppable machine of my own. I was healing. I was thriving. I was finally the man my grandfather would have been proud of. I absolutely love this. OP didn't go out seeking immediate, petty revenge, or trying to actively sabotage his dad's shop. He just took his raw skills, pivoted, and built something entirely his own. Objectively speaking, true success comes when you stop trying to prove your worth to toxic people and just focus on mastering your own craft. He earned every single view and dollar on that channel by just being authentic. And then, exactly 8 months after I drove away in the dark, my phone lit up on my workbench. The screen displayed a number I hadn't seen since the night they threw me out into the cold. Arthur Miller was calling. Silence is a funny thing. When you spend your entire life surrounded by the deafening roar of pneumatic drills, the heavy pounding of metal on metal, and the constant shouting of a domineering father, silence feels almost unnatural at first. It takes time to get used to the quiet. But over the course of 8 months, I had learned to love it. My new life was built on a foundation of peace. I had a thriving career as a floor manager during the day, and a rapidly expanding digital empire as the faceless craftsman behind steel and rust by night. I was profitable, I was respected, and most importantly, I was entirely self-made. The open wound of my family's betrayal had finally begun to scar over. And then, exactly 8 months after I drove away from Miller and Sons in the dead of winter, the past came knocking. I was standing at my workbench in the storage shed on a rainy Tuesday night, carefully polishing the chrome valve covers for a 1970 Chevelle build. The rhythmic motion of the polishing cloth was hypnotic. My phone was resting on the edge of the tool chest, playing a low-volume classic rock station. Suddenly, the music cut out. The screen lit up in the dim light of the garage, vibrating aggressively against the metal. I set down the rag and wiped my grease-stained hands on my shop towel. I stepped over, looked down at the screen, and my heart stopped dead in my chest. Arthur Miller. My father's name was glowing right there in the dark. It was the first time he had tried to contact me since the night he coldly ordered me to pack my bags and clear out to make room for Preston's VIP lounge. I just stood there, staring at the phone. 1,000 different emotions hit me like a freight train. Anger, confusion, a brief flicker of a son's desperate hope, and finally, a cold, hard sense of reality. I didn't reach for it. I watched it ring until the screen went black and the missed call notification popped up. A minute later, the little voicemail icon appeared. I let it sit there for an hour. I tried to go back to polishing the valve covers, but my hands were unsteady. Finally, I grabbed the phone, tapped the icon, and lifted the speaker to my ear. Elias! The voice that came through the speaker didn't sound like Arthur Miller, the general who used to run his shop with an iron fist, the man who never apologized and never showed a single ounce of weakness. Sounded completely broken. His voice was hoarse, wavering, and thick with an exhaustion that went straight down to his bones. Elias, please, the voicemail continued, the desperation bleeding through the digital compression. I don't know who else to turn to. I need you to call me back. It's bad over here. It's about the shop. It's about Preston. Things have gone completely wrong. I made a mistake. A massive mistake. Please, son. Just call me. The recording clicked off. I stood in the silent garage, the smell of metal polish sharp in my nose. I played the message a second time. I listened to the exact frequency of his breaking voice. I made a mistake. Funny how it takes a catastrophic disaster for a man to realize the value of the son he threw away like garbage. But I wasn't a naive kid anymore. I wasn't going to come running back just because the king had finally realized his golden prince was a jester. I deleted the voicemail. I didn't call him back. I wanted to hear the kingdom crumble a little more before I stepped out of the shadows. But the curiosity started gnawing at my gut like a bad transmission bearing. If Arthur Miller was swallowing his massive, inflated pride to beg me for help, something must have gone violently, irreparably sideways. I needed to know exactly what kind of damage Preston had done. The following Saturday, I did something I had sworn never to do. I drove back across the county line into my old hometown. I didn't go near the shop. Instead, I parked my truck 3 blocks away, across the street from a rundown, greasy spoon diner where all the senior mechanics and local blue-collar guys used to grab lunch. It was a place where nothing was a secret, and gossip flowed faster than cheap black coffee. I sat in a corner booth, pulling my baseball cap down low, and ordered a plate of eggs. Around noon, the bell above the door chimed, and in walked Hank. Hank was a master welder, a guy who had been working at Miller and Sons since I was a teenager. He was the one who first taught me how to lay a perfect TIG weld. He looked older, his shoulders slumped, wearing a faded jacket that didn't have the Miller logo on it anymore. I stood up and waved him over. Hank stopped dead in his tracks, squinting through his thick glasses. His jaw practically dropped. "Elias? I'll be damned. The ghost returns." He slid into the booth across from me, shaking his head in disbelief. "We all thought you moved out of state, kid. Good to see you. Though, I imagine you ain't here to catch up on old times." "I'm just passing through, Hank," I said, keeping my voice neutral. "I got a strange voicemail from my dad a few days ago. Sounded like he was panicking. What the hell is going on over there?" Hank let out a heavy, bitter sigh, running a calloused hand over his thinning hair. He looked around the diner before leaning in close, lowering his voice. "Man, your brother made a spectacular mess of the place. It's a bloodbath, Elias. A damn tragedy." "Define mess," I pushed. "The shop is basically a ghost town," Hank grumbled, staring into his coffee mug like it held the answers to the universe. "After you left, Preston went full Hollywood CEO. He fired 3 of our best senior techs because they didn't fit the new modern aesthetic. He spent tens of thousands of dollars completely rebranding the place. Brought in these flashy marketing agencies, hired kids off the internet to take photos of cars they didn't even know how to start, just to post on social media. He built that stupid VIP lounge, stocked it with top-shelf liquor, and tried to cater to these tech bro millionaires who only care about the paint job." "And the actual work?" I asked, feeling a dark knot tighten in my stomach. "What work?" Hank scoffed loudly. "With you gone, there was nobody to manage the floor, nobody to double-check the diagnostics. Preston was too busy playing golf and taking his girlfriend on business trips billed to the company card. Cars were sitting in the bays for months. Parts were ordered wrong. Engines were blowing up on the test drives. The old-school, loyal customers, the guys who kept us alive through the lean years, they pulled their cars out entirely. Word got around fast. Nobody trusts Miller and Sons anymore. The legacy your grandpa built? Preston burned it to the ground for Instagram likes. Are you still there?" I asked. Hank shook his head, looking disgusted. "Hell no. I walked out 2 months ago when my paycheck bounced." "Bounced? Can you believe that? A Miller and Sons check bouncing. Half the vendors in a 50-mile radius have cut them off for non-payment. Your dad. He's wandering around that empty shop looking like a ghost. He tried to take back control, but he legally signed everything over to Preston. He's trapped." I sat back against the vinyl booth, digesting the absolute magnitude of the destruction. 8 months. It only took Preston 8 months to destroy a 50-year-old institution. I paid for Hank's lunch, shook his hand, and walked out into the cold air. The pieces were falling apart, but I needed the exact financial details. I needed the hard proof. It was time to make another phone call. I drove back to my apartment, the rhythmic thumping of my tires on the highway matching the cold, calculated beating of my heart. I pulled into my driveway, locked the door behind me, and immediately opened my laptop. I pulled up an old contact I hadn't spoken to since my departure. Sarah. Sarah was the shop's head accountant. She was a razor-sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 40s who had managed the Miller and Sons books for over a decade. She always kept her head down, strictly navigated the treacherous waters of my family's politics, and was one of the very few people in that building who had ever treated me with genuine, professional respect. I dialed her personal cell number. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Hello, Sarah. It's Elias." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line, followed by a long, heavy pause. "Elias, my God, are you okay? Where are you?" "I'm fine, Sarah. Better than fine, actually. I'm sorry to call you out of the blue, but I ran into Hank today. He told me things are bad." I need to know exactly how bad. Off the record. I heard a bitter, exhausted laugh echo through the speaker. Bad? Elias, it's a financial apocalypse. I actually put in my 2 weeks' notice yesterday. I can't legally or morally attach my name to this sinking ship anymore. We ended up talking for over an hour. Sarah poured out every dark, dirty secret that Preston had desperately tried to sweep under the rug. When Arthur handed him the keys, Preston treated the company bank accounts like his personal ATM, Sarah explained, her voice trembling with professional outrage. He completely drained the operational reserves. I'm talking hundreds of thousands of dollars, Elias. He bought a brand new Porsche 911 GT3 as a company promotional vehicle. He charged luxury vacations, expensive dinners, and massive consulting fees to marketing agencies that didn't actually do anything. When the cash flow dried up because the loyal customers left, he panicked. What did he do? I asked, gripping the edge of my desk. He took out a massive second mortgage on the property lease, she revealed. He leveraged the shop's remaining assets to secure high-interest bridge loans just to make payroll and keep the lights on. But the worst part, Elias, the absolute worst part is what he's doing right now to cover his tracks. Sarah paused, and I could hear the hesitation in her breath. He's blaming you. The silence in my apartment became suffocating. Excuse me? He's blaming me? Yes, Sarah said quietly, her tone laced with disgust. He's gaslighting your father. He's actively telling Arthur that the massive debts, the missing funds, and the angry vendors are all your fault. He fabricated a story that you intentionally sabotaged the shop's inventory system and ordered hundreds of thousands of dollars in wrong parts before you left in a fit of jealousy. He's claiming you poisoned the relationships with the old clients and essentially planted a ticking time bomb in the business because you were bitter about not inheriting it. My mouth went completely dry. The sheer, unadulterated evil of it took my breath away. Preston hadn't just stolen my truck. He hadn't just stolen my inheritance. He was actively trying to rewrite history to turn me into the villain. He was burning down the house and pointing the finger at the guy who had been locked out in the cold. Does my dad actually believe him? I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Arthur is desperate, Sarah sighed. He's an old man watching his life's work vanish. Preston is a master manipulator. He forged a few internal emails to make it look like you were mishandling supplier contracts. Arthur wants to believe his golden boy is just a victim of circumstance. It's easier for him to blame the son he already threw away than to admit he handed the keys to a parasite. I thanked Sarah, told her I owed her a steak dinner, and hung up the phone. I sat in the dark for a long time. I thought the anger had faded. I thought I had moved on. But what I felt now wasn't just anger. It was a profound, icy clarity. 1 week later, the mailman dropped a thick, heavy envelope onto my porch. It required a signature. It was from a high-priced corporate law firm in the city. I tore it open, my eyes scanning the stiff, aggressively worded legal documents. Preston was suing me. It was a civil lawsuit filed on behalf of Miller & Sons LLC. He was formally suing me for $250,000 in compensatory damages. The lawsuit alleged corporate sabotage, breach of fiduciary duty, and intentional destruction of client relationships prior to my departure. It was a complete work of fiction, a desperate, flailing attempt by a drowning man to drag someone else under the water with him. He knew he couldn't win it in court, but he thought the sheer threat of massive legal fees would intimidate me, ruin my credit, and force me to settle quietly, giving him an influx of cash to survive another month. Stop right there. Preston literally drained the business accounts to buy a Porsche, destroyed the client list, racked up massive debt, and now he is trying to sue the brother they kicked out for $250,000? The sheer entitlement is mind-blowing. Narcissists will literally burn their own house down and then try to sue you for the cost of the matches. He thought I was still the quiet, submissive little brother who would just take the beating and clean up the mess. He had no idea who he was dealing with anymore. He had no idea about the digital empire I had built, the resources I now commanded, or the absolute fury he had just unleashed. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was a declaration of war. And betrayal, I realized, isn't just about the theft or the insult. True betrayal is the lie they tell the world about you after you're gone. When a man hands you a frivolous lawsuit wrapped in a blanket of malicious lies, the natural instinct is to explode. The instinct is to hire the most vicious defense attorney you can find, go on a public rampage, leak the true financial records to the entire town, and blast the receipts across every social media platform available. I could have made a video on steel and rust, exposing my brother to millions of people. I could have utterly humiliated Arthur and Preston in the court of public opinion. But I didn't. I held back. I sat at my workbench, looking at the framed photograph of my grandfather that I kept next to my tools. He was a man of immense integrity, a guy who let his craftsmanship speak louder than his words. I remembered a specific piece of advice he gave me when I was a kid, struggling to fix a badly mangled carburetor someone else had ruined. He put his heavy, oil-stained hand on my shoulder and said, "Elias, you don't win by burning the garage down to prove a point. You win by keeping your head down and building a better engine." For the first time in my life, I truly understood the profound weight of those words. Let Preston burn his fake kingdom. Let him scream his lies into the void. I didn't need to fight a trash fire with gasoline. I just needed to build something so monolithic, so incredibly undeniable, that the smoke from their collapse couldn't hide it anymore. I was going to execute a silent checkmate. My first move was infrastructure. Using the substantial sponsorship revenue and ad payouts I had been quietly stockpiling from my YouTube channel, I went hunting for real estate. I didn't want a shiny corporate building. I found a massive, abandoned industrial warehouse on the outskirts of town. It had incredible bones, exposed brick, heavy steel I-beams, and enough square footage to house 5 hydraulic lifts and a dedicated fabrication bay. I signed a long-term commercial lease under a newly registered LLC. I spent the next month working like a possessed man. I called in favors from guys in the trade. We rewired the electrical grid, poured fresh epoxy on the concrete floors, and installed state-of-the-art diagnostic equipment. I painted the walls myself, deep midnight blue and gunmetal gray. Once the physical shop was ready, I started making phone calls. I reached out to the people Preston had discarded. I called Sam, the master fabricator who had quit in disgust. I called Tina, the brilliant front desk manager Preston had fired for not fitting the vibe. I offered them higher salaries, full benefits, and a stake in a business built on actual respect. They accepted before I even finished the pitch. I quietly contacted the old, loyal clients, the guys with the classic cars who had pulled their accounts from Miller and Sons. I showed them the new facility. They brought their cars over immediately. But the final, most devastating piece of my strategy, the kill shot, required precision timing and insider knowledge. During my long phone call with Sarah the accountant, she had dropped a crucial piece of legal trivia that Preston, in his arrogance, had completely overlooked. When Arthur transferred the business to Preston, he only transferred the LLC, the brand name, and the physical inventory. He didn't transfer the land, because Arthur didn't own the land. Since the 1980s, Miller and Sons had leased the massive lot from a notoriously wealthy, reclusive local property magnate named Mr. Henderson for tax liability reasons. And according to Sarah, Preston was currently 5 months behind on the massive commercial rent payments. I put on my best suit, not a mechanic's uniform, but a sharp, tailored suit paid for by my own success, and drove to Mr. Henderson's private estate. I requested a meeting. Henderson was a shrewd, old-school businessman who despised incompetence. I sat across from him in his mahogany-paneled study and laid out my proposal. "Mr. Henderson," I said, sliding a thick folder across the desk, "I know Miller and Sons is defaulting on their lease. I know Preston Miller has leveraged the business into the ground. I'm not here to ask for a favor. I'm here to solve your problem." Henderson raised a bushy eyebrow, opening the folder. Inside were the certified financial statements for my YouTube empire and my new LLC, showing massive, liquid cash reserves and explosive month-over-month growth. "I am offering to buy the entire commercial lot, the building, and the land out from under Miller and Sons LLC. I stated calmly, looking the old man dead in the eye. I have the cash for a massive down payment, and I am pre-approved for the commercial mortgage. Clean buyout. No more chasing a delinquent tenant. You get a massive payday, and I get the dirt my grandfather built his life on. Henderson stared at the financials, then looked up at me. He had known my grandfather. He knew the difference between the men in my family. A slow, calculating smile spread across his weathered face. Your brother is a fool, Elias, and your father is blind for handing him the keys. If you can wire the earnest money by Friday, the land is yours. And I'll personally enjoy serving the eviction notice to that arrogant prick. We shook hands. The trap was officially set, armed, and buried right under their feet. They just didn't know they were standing on it yet. This was such a pro move by OP. Instead of losing his mind on social media or fighting some frivolous lawsuit, he went straight to the actual landowner. He turned it into a smart, legitimate business deal instead. He used his hard-earned money to buy the very land his family couldn't even afford to keep. The culmination of my strategy aligned perfectly with the annual Founders Auto Fair. It was the biggest, most prestigious automotive expo in the state, a massive gathering of custom builders, vintage collectors, and high-end vendors. It was where reputations were forged and lucrative contracts were signed. For the first time in 30 years, Miller & Sons Custom Garage did not have a booth. The organizers had quietly blacklisted them after several clients filed formal complaints regarding Preston's fraudulent business practices and ruined vehicles. But I was there. I had secured the massive, premium center stage booth under my new brand, Steel and Rust Restorations. I spared no expense. We had brilliant halogen lighting, massive professional banners displaying the sleek logo, and a live-action engine rebuild demonstration happening right in the middle of the floor. My crew, Sam, Tina, Hank, and 3 new apprentices, wore matching black shop shirts. We had 5 flawlessly restored classic muscle cars on display, including a magnificent 1969 Camaro that was drawing massive crowds. By noon, the booth was absolute chaos in the best way possible. Fans of the YouTube channel were lining up for photos. Wealthy collectors were handing me blank checks for custom builds. I was giving an interview to a national automotive magazine when I saw them out of the corner of my eye. Preston and Arthur. They were standing about 50 feet away, completely frozen, staring at the massive crowd gathered around my display. Preston was wearing his usual tailored designer shirt, sunglasses perched on his head, but his face was pale. He looked like a man who had just seen a ghost holding a shotgun. Arthur looked 10 years older than the last time I saw him. He was stooped, his face deeply lined with stress, the arrogant fire in his eyes completely extinguished. They started walking toward the booth. The crowd parted slightly. My crew noticed them and immediately tensed up. Hank gripped a heavy wrench a little tighter. I just held up a hand, signaling my team to stand down, and stepped forward to meet my family at the edge of the carpet. Elias? Preston sneered, his voice dripping with forced, desperate arrogance. He looked around the immaculate booth, his eyes twitching. Wow, didn't expect to see you playing mechanic at a real show. Nice setup. You max out a dozen credit cards to try and compete with the family business. I didn't blink. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at him with absolute, freezing pity. There is no competition, Preston. Not when one side is completely bankrupt. His jaw locked. A flash of genuine panic crossed his eyes. Watch your mouth. My lawyers are going to bury you for what you did to my shop. Your lawsuit is a joke, and we both know it. I replied smoothly, crossing my arms. I've countersued for malicious prosecution, defamation, and grand theft auto regarding my Ford F-150. By the time my legal team is done ripping apart your cooked books in discovery, you'll be lucky if you don't face federal fraud charges. Preston opened his mouth to bark back, but Arthur stepped in front of him. My father looked up at me, and for the very first time in my entire life, I saw genuine, unadulterated shame in his eyes. Elias, please, Arthur whispered, his voice cracking. Stop. Both of you, stop. He looked around at the thriving business I had built in 8 months, at the loyal employees he had lost, at the respect radiating from the crowd. "Can we speak in private? Just for a moment." I nodded slowly and gestured behind the massive display wall to a quiet staging area. Preston tried to follow, but I put a hand on his chest, shoving him back slightly. "Just him. You stay out here and pretend you're a CEO." Behind the wall, Arthur seemed to collapse into himself. He rubbed his hands over his face, trembling. "I was wrong," he choked out, the words sounding like glass tearing his throat. "God help me. I was so wrong. He destroyed it, Elias. He spent everything. The shop is drowning in debt. The legacy. Your grandfather's legacy is gone. I gave him the crown, but I didn't give him a map. And he burned the kingdom." I stood there, feeling nothing but a profound emptiness. "You didn't give him a map because you knew he couldn't read one," I said coldly. "You handed a 50-year-old institution to a guy who treated it like a shiny toy, simply because he looked better in a suit than I did." "I know," Arthur pleaded, reaching out a shaking hand. "I know I failed you, but I'm begging you. You have the skills. You clearly have the capital. Come back. Help me save Miller and Sons. I'll make you an equal partner. We can fix what he broke." I stared at the man who had thrown me out into the freezing night. I thought about my stolen truck. I thought about the years of verbal abuse, the blatant disrespect, the lawsuit designed to ruin my life. "No," I said, my voice as hard as forged steel. "Grandpa built that shop to last. You handed it to a parasite. I don't have to fix what you deliberately destroyed." Arthur's face crumpled. "Please, son. If we don't pay the rent by the end of the month, the landlord is going to evict us. We'll lose the physical building. We'll have nothing." I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a heavy, legal envelope and handed it to my father. "I know." Arthur took the envelope, his hands shaking violently. He opened the flap and pulled out the crisp, notarized documents. He read the first page, his eyes widening in absolute horror. He looked up at me, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "You're not dealing with Mr. Henderson anymore," I stated, my voice echoing with finality. "I bought the land, Arthur. I bought the building. I own the dirt you're standing on. And attached to that deed is a formal, 30-day eviction notice for Miller and Sons LLC. You have until the end of the month to pack your things. You don't belong there anymore." I used his exact words against him. The absolute symmetry of the moment was devastating. Arthur Miller dropped the papers on the floor, put his face in his hands, and openly wept. I didn't comfort him. I turned around and walked back out onto the showroom floor, back to my crew, back to my life. 30 days later, Miller and Sons LLC officially filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Preston's fake, filtered Instagram account vanished overnight. He moved out of state, dodging creditors. My father retired, moving into a small condo, entirely broken by the reality of his own hubris. I took possession of the old property. I didn't tear the building down. We gutted the VIP lounge, expanded the heavy machinery bays, and scrubbed the old, tainted name off the brickwork. A massive new steel sign went up above the main garage doors. Steel and Rust Legacy Division. I kept a few of the old black and white photos of my grandfather on the wall. I wasn't erasing history. I was honoring the only parts of it that actually mattered. I finally had a shop full of engines humming in perfect harmony, grease permanently under my fingernails, and a name on the sign that meant something real. Not because someone handed it to me, but because I survived the fire, took the ashes, and built an unstoppable engine of my own. Let's really unpack this ending for a second. A lot of people might say he was too harsh on his dad. But honestly, Arthur enabled a literal criminal and threw his hardworking son in the trash. You reap exactly what you sow. Let's see what the Reddit community had to say about this, because the comments on this thread were absolutely on fire. User GreaseMonkey99 says, "Your dad and brother literally committed grand theft auto and forgery when they sold your truck. The fact that you didn't press felony charges right then and there makes you a saint. Handing them the eviction notice was the cleanest, most professional revenge ever." Enjoy your new shop. I completely agree with this comment. Forging a signature to sell a man's classic truck is a massive crime. OP was way too nice by just walking away initially. They had it coming. But we always have a different perspective on Reddit. Let's look at this comment from devil_advocate_23. Yes, your brother is an entitled thief, and your dad was completely blind. But buying the land just to actively evict your own elderly father and bankrupt the family legacy? That's just cold and vindictive. You became just as ruthless as them. You know what? I'm going to have to respectfully disagree with that take. Elias didn't destroy the family legacy. Preston did. By the time Elias bought the land, they were already 5 months behind on rent and getting evicted anyway. Elias actually saved the physical location from being turned into a strip mall. He preserved the real legacy under a new name. Finally, user Autolife_chick shares. My heart broke when they sold your F-150. I've restored cars, and that's like selling a piece of your soul. I'm so glad you got the ultimate payback. Absolutely right. That truck was his sanctuary, and they violated it. But I want to turn it over to you guys. Do you think Elias went too far by handing his dad the eviction notice? Or was it the exact reality check they deserved for tossing him aside? Drop your thoughts down in the comments below. And hey, if you enjoyed this wild revenge story, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more crazy Reddit content, and I will see you guys in the next video.